Dr. Seth, we want to set up the conversation a little bit for the lay people who will be joining, because of course this is a very, as we said, you have experts in the audience here, but for people to understand, what is it we're talking about when we talk about the need for safety standards and quality? Because to my mind, you're not going to find anyone who disagrees that when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to patient care, that you need the highest possible standards, that you need safety checks and quality checks. But as a hospital administrator, from the hospital point of view, what are the big issues and loopholes here?
Yeah, and I think we must understand that quality healthcare, as we talk about, has to be a safe healthcare. While it's affordable, affordability does not compromise on quality. So it becomes efficient but quality-based healthcare. And what are we talking about in quality? Perhaps nowhere than anywhere else is needed this quality standardization in healthcare, because these devices, or whatever we talk about, when we take care of patient, it affects his life. It affects patient's life. The way we treat our patient, the devices we use, even the bed he lies on, even the way he walks to the bathroom, can all affect his well-being, his life, and his longevity of life. And it comes even further on, and this is for the lay viewers to understand, that every treatment that we offer is to do with some drug or some device. And if it's a device, then the quality of the device impacts totally the outcome, the subsequent life, the well-being, and how long is the treatment going to last for. Unfortunately, as science and technology has grown, the regulations should have been in place to monitor these more effectively, because patient's life is at stake. And a doctor and any paramedical or any industry cannot do that alone in itself. So we're talking about something which is valuable. It's almost like if I was having a treatment and I needed to be good and well, then I had to have a safe device in. And I should only do to my patients what I would do to myself. So if I cannot trust a device, then I can't even use it with my patients. Regulatory framework around this has to be robust. For example, why do we actually talk about an FDA-approved device? I still have patients coming to me and I say, let me implant to you an Indian stent. And they say, no, oh no, I'd rather have the American stent at 3 times the cost, because a robust, reliable, overarching, unbiased, unadulterated framework has been set so clearly to define safety standards that nobody argues against them, and we are in a situation of a wishy-washy life. Having got the devices under regulation, but not understanding how to go beyond that, unfortunately.
So, on that note, I'm just going to bring in Upayan here, because when you bring in the US FDA, it's very interesting, and we do have to talk about the regulatory framework and, where Indian standards are. But, UL has been working with the US FDA and making sure that different companies, even countries even, are certified to those standards. Where do you see India and Indian standards vis-a-vis that kind of matrix?
Thank you. So, Amrita, thank you for the question, and I'm really happy to be on this esteemed panel. And very impressed by everyone's credentials, so this is great. Look, I think when you think of the Indian context, and with Dr. Trehan and the other guests that have spoken before me, it's really impressive to understand the awareness at this level of the requirement for safety, because we're treating patients, we're treating our family, and we're looking for positive outcomes. The FDA and other bodies, especially around the world, where in Europe, they've dealt with this for several years, decades, and it's all around, again, the patient outcome, the treatment that you go through has to be a positive treatment. And it's not just the treatment itself, right? You look at the device, you look at the operator, and look at the patient. It's kind of this trifecta. When it comes to the Indian context, we really have to look at it from the basic standpoint, which I really liked how Dr. Trehan said it. Look, every patient is your family. Every patient needs to have a positive outcome, and that's really nice, because that's the way we should look at every interaction. So we start with the basics, and then we have the opportunity to really start defining it and taking it to the next level. Right? If we want to be competitive in the global landscape from a healthcare delivery standpoint, we've got to now start looking at it from the perspective of how do we evolve from a technology standpoint? How do we make it safer so that in a global and a scalable context, it becomes easier to deliver that healthcare? So that's where obviously the intelligence that's based around in this room, as well as the expertise that we bring from the industry, can really come to the table and have a harmonized approach of how do you actually deliver that.
Sort of get to the next level.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Sharma, in fact, in terms, because we are also looking at what there's one scenario for the private players, and of course the government has to look at the entire the cohort where they bring both government and the sort of public-private model into being. Now, what is it that the health ministry feels are the sort of bottlenecks and challenges? Because obviously there is this need for a regulatory framework. Is something we're hearing across the board.
Thank you very much. I think you have put the right question to all my panelists and to me also. Essentially, safety is one of the most vital ingredients in healthcare, whether it is of the medical devices, whether it is of the drugs, or it is of the other medical products. So what we need to do is to evolve standards and convert those standards into regulations. In the Indian context, as of now, in medical devices particularly, maybe all the standards are not developed. But it is not that there is a complete vacuum in terms of standards also. We have the standards which have been set up by the Bureau of Indian Standards. We have, in other cases where there are no standards set up by the Bureau of Indian Standards, adopted the standards or recognized the standards set up by ISOs. And in other cases, we are acknowledging the standards that have been set up by the industry worldwide. So with the perspective of patient safety in view, there is adoption of those standards. We did not invent everything every time we have to do it. So the time right now is for harmonization, adoption, and globalization of those standards. That is how we look. But I think the challenge is big because in terms of the diversity of the medical service providers, ranging from a single doctor establishment to the large corporate hospitals, there's a lot of diversity. And similarly in the production milieu also, there is a lot of diversity in terms of quality parameters, adherence to quality and quality assurance and things like that. There is a need for doing a lot more, and the government is conscious of that. In the last 1 year, I think we have been working closely with all stakeholders, including the industry and even people from the non-governmental sectors, to evolve standards. To evolve standards and to set up a kind of a regulatory framework. And we have succeeded partly, we will be succeeding further in the future. And a lot of things have been done and a lot of things are in the pipeline.
Right. And it's interesting because Mr. Sharma is also essentially saying you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Mr. Pandey, one of the things you were mentioning earlier was that there is a debate to be had about what is the minimum sort of best practice or best quality of standards that you can, there is some wriggle room there. And in terms of looking at the entire domestic scenario, you have to weigh the sort of cost benefits as well.
I think I would approach this particular question in a slightly different way, giving what the global perspective is. How does it operate? See, globally, there are two agreements which exist, which are multilateral agreements. One is the TBT agreement, another is the SPS agreement. And these two agreements provide the basic framework of standards, right? And these standards are essentially two types. One, voluntary standards, right? Voluntary standards are those standards where it is not mandatory for the manufacturer to comply with those standards. So it's voluntary in nature. So, and it is driven by, therefore, market forces. But when it comes to mandatory standards, the mandatory standards are those technical regulations where standards which have been set have been mandated by respective national governments to be complied mandatorily. And in what situation they have to be complied? Only 5 reasons exist globally which give you reason to have mandatory standards. This is safety, health, environment, national security, and deceptive practices. So if any of these 5 parameters have to be complied with, then the national governments will have to provide mandatory standards. Now, today we are talking of safety standards. So this cannot be voluntary, and therefore the government has powers to regulate safety standards, and healthcare sector world over is one of the most regulated sector. There are 2-3 sectors which are more regulated than the healthcare sector, but this is one of the highest regulated sector. And therefore, what should be, coming to the question now that you posed, what should be the minimum? The minimum is patient safety. Now, if you can comply with the safety and you can demonstrate that, now what this agreement asks for, that whatever standards you fix, means government fixes, it should demonstrate that it meets all requirement of patient safety. Now, there is a procedure for demonstrating that compliance, which is through various means. In Indian scenario, now, Mr. K.L. Sharma very correctly pointed out, many standards on medical devices also existed, but they are not mandated to be complied mandatorily. As a result of which, what happened in the market, all kinds of standards are floating. Now government is coming out very clearly that since it involves patient safety, and internationally, I must add here, you are also given that if in addition to safety, you can prove that additional safety is required in your case, in any country's case, then you are mandated to even authorize that additional safety standard, and nobody can challenge. So therefore, challenge for India is to have that, as Dr. Seth said, have a very robust kind of and very dynamic regulatory regime which catches up with the pace with which technology is changing. Because medical devices, today you have 18,000, tomorrow you will have 20,000. That means the number is getting added, and every day. So the challenge for any regulatory agency, therefore, is also to have a very dynamic ecosystem, right? Which works with the industry, which works with professionals, works with academic institutions which are involved in research, and they are in tune with the changing times. So if we cannot, in today's scenario, we cannot be a regulator watching from a distance. We have to be amidst the changing complexities of this field. We have to be there together, and that is how most of the developed countries, they work standards and technical regulation together with the industry. You pick up, you talked about US FDA. The US FDA fixes the standards and the mandatory regulations, what they call technical regulations, in conjunction with the industry and the research institution. And people move in, move out. That is also very dynamic there. Today I can be in US FDA, tomorrow I can be part of the industry, and vice versa. And that is how things have kept pace with the changing times.
That's an interesting point. And Mr. Khurana, I mean, part of the challenge seems to be also raising consumer awareness, and that demand also has to come, as you're saying, it's a, as Mr. Pandey is saying, it's a holistic approach. The demand also has to come, and I think Dr. said this quite clearly in that sort of short film we played. Now, with BPL medical devices, we've also been talking a little bit about some of the challenges that crop up in the kind of scenario we have right now.
Yeah, so let me take it slightly differently. As Dr. Seth said in the beginning that, Patient wants only highest quality and he wants to go for a FDA. Now, you look at the Indian context. The population, we are probably able to serve at the top of the pyramid, very different level of people. The overall market is such where there is a lots and lots of people making a product and it has a demand at different level. What NABL or NABH has done, probably there is a lack of clarity today for a manufacturing side on the standard, that this is minimum what needs to be attained, right? If a challenge on the even R&D is also, it has not been still at the level what is seen outside. So clearly those are the areas which we today feel challenged. At the same time, if you look at the ecosystem, I mean, just compare auto industry. How auto industry has gone, and today the products made here are world class. We need to also learn a lot from what pharma has done today. I mean, pharma is a big example, started in 1990 with just $1 or $2 billion. Today it's a $30 billion because generic is something which they have adopted, and government supported a lot. So we clearly are looking for some direction, because if I want to just go for a C mark, I'll go for a C mark. Somebody else says I'll only take a BIS and routine approval. One good practice I've seen, at least in the one area, is the radiation side. We have really progressed very, very well. I mean, I witnessed last 35 years. It was from none to today completely regulated. There is not a single X-ray radiating product which has not been either done by AERB completely or not done by hospital. And as you said, customer awareness. With hospital, we do a lot of those awareness programs. I mean, if you go to X-ray room, you will see one red light there. Clearly awareness that the radiation area. You go to MRI, somebody will check you that whether you are having some implant inside, and if you go inside the MRI room, it may be a disaster. So it's a partnership which we do. But if you look at lots and lots of awareness is done more from the hospital side. That's how I look at it.
Interesting, because I mean, we're talking about creating this whole ecosystem, and you were saying earlier there is something to be said about the social movement. Would you want to weigh in on that?
In fact, most of the points which I had to say have been already very well covered by the previous speakers and the panelists. So I'd like to talk about the sociological, the economic, and the legal acceptance of standards. And for want of a better example, I would like to take you to Sagar, where I grew up. Now, there was a bungalow there in civil lines on the main road. It had a boundary wall. Now, people used to urinate on that wall. Then the owners of that bungalow put a strong message there. Yahan, I'm not using the other word, yahan urinate karna mana hai. The number of people urinating there started increasing. So when they tried to find out why is this happening, and they asked a couple of people there, they said, "Ye kaun hote hain?" जो मैंने ही पूछा उनसे, ये कौन होते बताने के लिए कि यहाँ क्या करना चाहिए, क्या नहीं करना चाहिए, या क्या ये क्या कलेक्टर हैं, क्या एसपी हैं क्या? So a tendency, then these people, they were known to us. They said how to stop it. So somebody said put a good painting of a god or a goddess there, that will stop it. But then they said, उसमें खर्चा आएगा, चौक से बना दें क्या? तो चौक से बना दें क्या, उसमें कॉस्ट पे there was a cost consideration, but चौक से तो जल्दी से धुल जाएगा. They wanted to impose a certain kind of behavior, a certain standard, but they were not willing to spend on it. So standards will always require some expenditure. So that is the socio-economic side. I was sitting with a friend of mine. He runs a very big university in Chhattisgarh. He was telling me that when I brought standard operating procedure for all my 3,000 employees, in that year, 50% turnover I had. Now coming back to the wall, recently I visited Sagar. I realized that that wall is clean now. Nobody is urinating there. And in a lighter way, I asked that gentleman, what happened? How was this stopped? It was written, he said it is because of the which the ad was Nike ad, just do it. So they are not listening still. This is one point we will have to consider, that when Indians are in India, when it is written push on a door, they will usually pull, mark it. I'm a sociologist, I'm a student of sociology. And when it is written push, they will say, they will pull the door. So this is one thing which we have to fight. Second point which we need to look at is the legal side. It should not so happen that I am fully for standards, and I am fully for what Mr. Pandey very eloquently said, that standards should be a dynamic thing. They should keep on evolving with the help of industry also, with the help of the user. For example, in MHRA, recently, it was found that a urinary catheter which was used, which was meant for women, was used accidentally in a male and the male died. So this point was reported to the standard making body, and they ensured that now on the labeling, and even when the product is out of the pack, then also it is very clearly notified that this is for a male and this is for a female. The distinguishing mark was made. So similarly, our standards also should evolve. However, no new standards should be brought in accidentally, and I am saying this in the presence of 3 very gentlemanly bureaucrats who have always allowed us to say our piece, accidentally as a market barrier. It should be a quality enhancer, but no advertently or inadvertently, no new marks or standard should come which becomes a market barrier, and then, because then the purpose of the standard is defeated. These are my...
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, because usually, I mean, when you have a debate like this, people are allergic to this idea of over-regulating. So it's important to get that sense of a national, sort of the reason to, let's not forget the reason you need these standards, which is...
Can I add a very brief
Come- yeah,
point on
please.
this? It's a very important point, and that is what is called technical barriers to trade, which means that a standard which is not required should not be there.
Yeah.
It has to be scientifically justified. In India, as Dr. Seth had mentioned, see what happened, if you do not have mandatory standards within the country, then all substandard products, because your law does not provide that this product has to be mandatorily having a particular standard. So what happened in India, that many substandard products also got dumped. Now, this may not be true for medical devices, partly in some cases also for this sector.
Yeah.
But it got dumped, and therefore all the more reason
To have a...
have standards which are mandated standards, compulsory standards, to ensure patient safety. Because if you don't have standards, then you cannot regulate it, and any product can come into your market, even if it is not coming indigenously, it can come from any of the export markets.
I also want to state, this is so important. The reason we are all sitting together is that I see a ray of hope over the last 2-3 years, a greater realization than when in 2006, device industry was taken over into regulation. And for a long time, there was a gap in even understanding and instituting the archaic laws of 1940. That's why I said the dynamic issue you said is so paramount important. We're living in a changing world. We're living in a changing scenario. And most of all, not just dynamic, but every stakeholder has to be involved in it. Yeah. These mandatory standards cannot be created by one body who says, I know it all, and this is how you actually function in this country, or disappear. That will ruin our indigenization of our industry. That may actually make healthcare more expensive. That may actually be the biggest disaster that we're actually thinking of. So when we talk about saying it is expensive, you're right, it is expensive, but because it is so necessary, because we cannot function without it, sitting together, and who are the stakeholders at the end of the day? The industry, which has to manufacture these, and is also saying that we want standards, because actually the industry is suffering the most from all this. Then there is the doctor like me, who has to actually use these devices in daily practice, and at the end of the day, I'm worried about the life of my patient, not just in the short term, but when he goes home, and for the next many years. He has to live on that valve that I implanted. He's got to live on a stent that I implanted for years and years. And it could actually be manufactured theoretically anywhere in the world. Yeah. It could be coming from a country, let alone, we always pride ourselves on the manufacturing which happens in this country, but it could be coming from anywhere, Timbuktu in the world. And that worries us. There is the other stakeholder, is the patient himself. What standards does the patient want? Have we ever thought of that? What does he actually believe in? What does he want to believe in? Why does he talk about FDA and not about anything else which exists in this country? And then, don't forget, we talk about educated, but what about the undereducated?
Yeah.
What about them? Do they understand what we're talking about? When we sit here and talk about standards, he hasn't even got the money to pay for a little device like that. He can't even pay 25,000. But that doesn't mean that affordable healthcare gets to an inadequate, cheap, substandard healthcare. What I deliver at the Escorts Heart Institute, I should be able to deliver the same outcomes, even if I did that procedure at 1/10 the cost, and even if I did it in the smallest city. Unless the patient walks out in the same manner and has the same life expectation, I'm not doing the right thing. Affordable healthcare cannot become substandard. When we put into all that, and then the government, which actually has to regulate all this, which has the overarching ability to create laws, we all then have to sit together. But we have to do this in a defined manner. Unfortunately, we keep talking about it. Today we're talking about the same thing as we talked about 3 years ago and 5 years ago. Slight difference. Of course, we've created the regulations. It has to go through and all that. But somehow I believe that if all of us believe into it, then the same practice has to be hastened and it has to be applied.
And, Mr. Chairman, let me ask you, you do have this draft policy right now, right? The National Medical Device Authority. It has been framed. It's not yet in practice. Where are we in terms of this? I mean, you can see the spectrum of what people want to move, get there faster. Where are we in terms of that sort of mechanism?
I'm very happy to know that there is a demand for more regulation. Generally, there is a conflict between the regulator and the regulatee. And it's a sign of, I think, or moving in the right direction, that there is a demand which is coming for more standardization, better standardization. The bill which you are talking about has been drafted. We have done all consultations with the states, consultations with the industry, consultations with the public in general. And after taking into account all the suggestions, comments, recommendations that had come, the bill is now ready. We are going to have the bill most probably introduced in the budget session, later part of the budget session. Before that, there is an exercise to place it before the group of ministers. And the group of ministers will be considering it on day after tomorrow. So that is where we are moving. But in the meantime, we are not necessarily waiting for the bill to become an act. And what we have done is that we have come out with the alternative mechanism. The draft set of rules have been prepared, they have been kept in readiness. In case there is a further delay in the law getting enacted, in that event, we will be making whatever changes we can make within the existing laws also, and put in position a robust regulatory framework. Of course, it won't be the same as it would be when the law becomes, when the bill becomes the act, but nonetheless it is there. And for that purpose, one is the enabling law, regulations, rules, etc. And the second is the enabling set of people. And for that purpose, we have already moved a proposal that is an advanced stage, where we are going to have specialist people for looking after the medical device regulation. We have taken some people on contract from industry also. They are working on that. And in future, we are going to recruit people on the regular side. Similarly, for other areas such as biologicals and others, also the standard setting process has to commence, and we have identified certain set of skills that with which we need the people over there. Those are also being worked out.
So in process.
So we are looking at both alternatives, the enactment of the law, and in case there is a delay in enactment of the law, then within the existing framework of the law, there will be a definite regulatory framework with qualified personnel available in the structures.
So, I mean, as we're seeing this, so you want to say that?
Yeah, just to add one point, that one of the speakers said beautifully there is an uneven desire in us to excel. It might be there in you, it might not be there in me, it might be there to some extent in him, and so on. So, when we are talking about an uneven desire to excel, and we want to standardize, then of course a lot of effort and resources have to go into training, which is going, and that's why people are changing. That change is palpable. So that brings the cost element. The other thing is following other standards also brings in cost element. So I am not for profiteering at all, price profiteering at all. Wherever you find profiteering, you should definitely move in. However, if we bring in a price control mechanism, which is a kind of a blanket mechanism, it has the huge, it carries the huge danger of not allowing people to follow standards. And usually in healthcare, because people will skip standards to be able to make it worth their while to stay in that business.
Right.
Otherwise, that whole sector will become unattractive, be it in the medical devices sector or the healthcare or even the hospital sector. So whatever remedy is brought in, this is our request to three great officers sitting here. I'm sure you are keeping this fact in mind, sirs.
2 points.
Okay,
Very quick points.
Yes.
One was issue on price. Another was what should be the minimum standard. So on these 2 points, one should be very clear. Coming to the second question first, the regulator's job is to ensure patient safety. So any minimum standard that provides maximum safety is the standard appropriate for that sector, right? Now, anything additional which you get by giving improved standard is over and above, and it is not mandatory. Try to make a distinction, which means in the market, you may have multiple products, but if they are offering additional features, additional claims, regulator has to only look for minimum standard for maximum safety, and then comes the issue of price. If you actually look at, safety has no price. Now, which means if you are actually giving a safe equipment, in the long run, it is much more economically cheaper than providing a substandard counterfeit product for a shorter duration or at the cost of the life.
Opan, I will bring you in here and we do have to open for questions and wind up actually, but just in terms of creating this, you have a lot of stakeholders, the momentum is growing. Obviously, as Ms. Pandey is saying, when it comes to the extremely high level of standards, you need to have the consumer. The last sort of mile is the stakeholder, the most important stakeholder would be the patient or the consumer. How important is creating that sort of demand?
Yeah, look, I think it goes back to the awareness that we talked about. We as a consumer, anybody as a consumer has to demand absolute safety, right, in the interaction between me, myself and the device and the clinician. And so, look, the pull has to come. As a regulator, all you're doing is basically following the mandate of the people. And the people should be demanding safer healthcare, safer interaction, safer delivery of healthcare. And so for us to raise the profile of the fact that they should demand that should be a right for them.
Yeah.
And the fact that the devices that they interact with should be safe at world-class levels, and the clinicians should be trained in a way that they're able to perform the best, the best procedures with those devices. So it's absolutely imperative to ensure that the patient, the final consumer, is pulling for this.
There's one very important point we're all missing. And before we open it to discussion, we've talked about safety of devices, but we've not talked about safety of the doctors, safety of the physicians. Now, the West, by the way, always ensures not just safety of devices, safety of physicians who treat the patients. In fact, outcome measures everybody's results. कोई ऐसा नहीं होता है वहाँ पे जो कहता है कि जी मेरी तो सर्जरी 100% कोई मरता ही नहीं है, मैं तो बेस्ट हूँ. There is never a situation like that. It's audited. It is up on the website. Not just that it's up on the website, every doctor's performance of his complications, but also his appropriateness. क्यों की है angioplasty? क्यों की है surgery? What were the direct indications? have you filled in the form for appropriateness of every patient that you've treated? Now, can we believe that we're still living in our archaic world? We have a long way to go to ensure safety of our patients. Why do we see a degradation of moral ethics and standards amongst doctors? And yet we need more and more doctors in specialized fields. We want to train them and we want to send them to smaller cities to do surgeries, to do angioplasties, because it decreases cost for the patient to have the treatment at his doorstep and not come to the big institutes of Delhi or our metro cities. And yet, how are we ensuring the quality of those? The International Society, I was a part of a consortium between Harvard Business School, between the Karolinska University and the Boston Consultancy Group, where we thought that international standards for health outcome measures need to be created, standardized, and hospitals should follow the same around the world. And can you believe that those measures are now coming into face? And the other day, one of the big health insurance companies actually stated that these measures would perhaps be the measures in which they would actually reimburse hospitals if they couldn't come up with these measures on their website and say, these were reproducible, these were auditable, this is our bypass surgery results on a standardized measure format, this is our angioplasty results, and these are reproducible, they're auditable, and they're from this date to this date. Now, I think we've got to move in that direction as well.